I found out on a Tuesday afternoon. The kind of afternoon that doesn't feel important until it changes your life. The house was quiet in that heavy way it gets when the sun starts to lower but no lights are on yet. I had just made tea. I remember that because the mug was still too hot to hold properly, and I was shifting it from one hand to the other while standing in the hallway. The mail had been pushed through the slot earlier. I hadn't looked at it right away. Most days it's just bills, flyers, things I already know are coming. That day, one envelope didn't look like the others. Thick paper. A return address from a legal office I didn't recognize. I stood there longer than I should have. Not because I was scared. More because I didn't understand why it was there. I hadn't contacted a lawyer. I hadn't asked for anything. I hadn't told anyone I needed help with legal matters. Still, my name was printed clearly on the front. Full name, correct spelling, no mistake. I set the mug down on the hallway table and opened the envelope with my finger. The paper inside was folded neatly, professional, clean. The words were calm, polite, almost friendly. They were asking me to confirm changes to my estate plan. I read that line 3 times. Confirm changes, not discuss, not consider, confirm. I felt something move in my chest. Then, not pain, not panic. It mentioned updated beneficiaries, revised percentages, a power of attorney already filed. My hands started to shake, but lightly, like my body hadn't caught up yet to what my mind was seeing. I leaned against the wall and read the name at the bottom. My son, his full name, middle initial included, signed. I laughed. I actually laughed out loud once, sharp and short. It came out wrong, like a cough pretending to be humor. There had to be some mistake, a clerical error, a misunderstanding. My son wouldn't do that. He wouldn't go behind my back. He wouldn't try to change my will. He wouldn't file legal documents in my name. I folded the letter and sat down on the bottom step of the staircase. The wood felt cold through my clothes. The house creaked the way it always does when someone sits there, like it was acknowledging me. I told myself to breathe. Then I noticed the second page. It was a copy of a document. Not the full thing, just a summary. Enough to be clear. My name typed at the top. My address. My date of birth. All correct. Below that, a section labeled grantor. Below that, a signature. It was my name. It was supposed to be my name. But it wasn't my handwriting. The letters were stiff, forced, like someone trying to copy from memory. Close enough that a stranger might not notice. Wrong enough that I did. I had signed my name the same way for over 40 years. I knew every curve of it, every place my pen lifted. This wasn't it. My son had signed my name. I sat there for a long time. Long enough that the tea in the kitchen went cold. Long enough that the sun slipped fully behind the houses across the street. Long enough that my legs started to ache from the step pressing into them. I wasn't crying. That came later. First, there was just this quiet pressure behind my eyes. A deep, stunned stillness. I kept thinking, there must be a reason. Maybe he thought he was helping. Maybe someone told him it was necessary. Maybe he believed I wanted this and just didn't know how to say it. That's what I told myself, because the other option hurt too much to look at directly. I stood up slowly and went back into the kitchen. The house smelled faintly like old wood and lemon cleaner. Normal smells. Safe smells. Nothing in the room looked different, but everything was. I sat at the table and read the letter again, slower this time. The law firm was requesting my confirmation within 10 business days. If I did not respond, they would proceed based on the documentation. Submitted, proceed. I imagined strangers in clean offices, quietly redistributing the pieces of my life while I sat at my kitchen table with cold tea. I reached for my phone. Then I stopped. I didn't call my son right away. That surprised me. I had always been the kind of parent who picked up the phone first, asked questions, gave space for explanations, smoothed things over before they became sharp. But something told me not to rush. Instead, I opened the drawer where I kept important papers. Not everything, just the things I might need quickly. Birth certificate, insurance, the original copy of my will. I hadn't looked at it in years. There was no need. I trusted it to be what it was. I pulled it out and laid it on the table. The paper was slightly yellowed now, the edges soft. My signature at the bottom was unmistakably mine. Everything in it was exactly how I remembered. Nothing had changed, which meant the changes had happened somewhere else. I picked up the phone again, and this time, I called the number on the letter. A woman answered. Her voice was polite, steady, practiced. I told her my name. I told her I had received a letter about changes I hadn't made. There was a pause. Just a second too long. She said she'd pull up my file. I listened to the faint sound of typing. Each tap felt loud. Then she said, carefully, that the documents appeared valid, that they had been submitted with what they believed was proper authorization. I asked her what that authorization was. She said a signed power of attorney. I asked when it had been signed. She gave me a date. It was 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks ago, my son had come over for dinner. He had brought dessert. He had hugged me before he left. He had stood right there in this kitchen, leaning against the counter, talking about work, about stress, about how hard things had been lately. 3 weeks ago, I was fine. I was capable. I was clear. I had signed nothing. I told her that. There was another pause. This one longer, she said gently, that I could come in to discuss it. That if I believed fraud had occurred, there were steps. Fraud. That word landed differently. Heavy. Final. I thanked her and hung up. My phone felt heavier than usual in my hand. I set it down and stared at it like it might move on its own. I didn't know what hurt more in that moment. The fear of losing control over my own life, or the quiet, creeping understanding that my son had thought I wouldn't notice, or worse, that he thought I wouldn't matter. I stood up and walked through the house, slowly, as if seeing it for the first time. The living room where I had rocked him to sleep when he was small. The hallway where his height had been marked on the wall in pencil. The spare room that still held boxes of his old things because he never quite took everything when he moved out. This was the inheritance he was trying to take, not just money, this place, this history, this proof that I had built something and held it together. I sat back down and finally let myself cry. Not loud, not dramatic, just quiet tears that fell onto my hands while I pressed my lips together to keep from making a sound. I felt embarrassed for crying, angry at myself for feeling embarrassed, tired in a way that sleep doesn't fix. After a while, the tears stopped on their own. That's when the clarity came, not the kind that makes you feel strong right away, the kind that makes things sharp and clear and impossible to ignore. My son hadn't come to me. He hadn't asked. He hadn't even warned me. He had gone straight to paperwork, to signatures, to legal control. Whatever his reasons were, he had made one thing clear. He didn't trust me with my own choices, and that changed something between us. Something deep. I cleaned my face and went back to the table. I gathered the letter, the copy of the document, my original will. I lined them up neatly. I didn't know yet what I was going to do, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going to pretend this didn't happen, and I wasn't going to stay silent. When I think back on my life, it doesn't come to me in big moments first. It comes in small ones. Mornings that felt the same for years. Habits that formed without asking. The quiet work of holding things together while no one was watching. I raised my son mostly on my own. That's not something I used to say out loud. Not because it wasn't true, but because it felt like complaining. His father was there in the early years, technically. He lived in the house. He ate dinner at the table. But he was always somewhere else in his mind. Tired, distant, gone before he actually left. When the marriage ended, there was no big fight. Just a slow understanding that I was already doing this alone. My son was 9 when his father moved out. Old enough to notice. Young enough to think it might somehow be his fault. I remember sitting on the edge of his bed that night, the light from the hallway spilling in because he didn't like the door fully closed back then. He asked me if things would be normal again. I told him yes. I meant it in the way parents do. I meant that I would make a new normal and pretend it was what we had planned all along. Money was tight after that. Not dramatic, just constant. The kind of tight that makes you do math in your head every time you reach for something at the store. The kind that makes you keep the same coat for 10 years and tell yourself it's still fine. I worked full-time, sometimes more than full-time. I took extra shifts when they were offered. I said yes when I wanted to say no. I learned how to stretch meals, how to fix things instead of replacing them, how to smile when people asked how I was doing. My son grew up watching that, watching me count cash at the kitchen table, watching me fall asleep on the couch with paperwork still in my lap, watching me say things like, "It's okay," even when it wasn't. I never told him he owed me anything. I told him he could be anything. That mattered to me. That he felt free. That he didn't feel trapped by my choices or my struggles. I wanted him to dream bigger than I ever had. And he did. He was smart, curious, restless, always asking questions that went a little past what I knew how to answer. Teachers liked him, said he had potential, said he just needed focus. When he went to college, I cried harder than I expected. Not because I didn't want him to go, because it felt like letting go of something I had been holding with both hands for so long that I didn't know what to do with myself without it. I helped how I could. Not much, but what I had. I took on more hours. I dipped into savings I had promised myself I wouldn't touch. I told myself it was an investment in him, in his future. When he graduated, I was proud, truly proud. He had done something I hadn't. He had built a path that didn't look like mine, but somewhere along the way, things shifted. It wasn't sudden. It never is. It was small comments at first, little sighs when I talked about money, suggestions that I should think about downsizing, questions about what I planned to do long term. At first, I thought it was care, concern, the kind children show when they start to see their parents as human instead of solid. I told him I was fine, that I liked my house, that I had plans. He nodded, but he didn't really hear me. He started stopping by more often, sometimes without calling first. He'd look around, not in a rude way exactly, but in a measuring way, like he was taking stock. Once, he commented that the stairs might be hard for me. Eventually. I laughed it off, told him eventually was a long way away. He didn't laugh. He talked a lot about responsibility, about being prepared, about how people our age sometimes didn't realize when it was time to let go of control. Our age. I noticed that phrase, how easily it came to him. I was still working then, still driving, still paying my bills, still capable. But something in his tone had changed. He spoke to me slower sometimes, explained things I already understood, corrected me when I told stories, as if my memory needed help. I told myself I was imagining it. That's what mothers do. We protect our children's intentions even when they start to bruise us. After his father passed away, there was a small inheritance. Not life-changing money, just enough to matter, just enough to make plans around. That money came to me. I didn't rush to use it. I didn't talk about it much. I put it somewhere safe and told myself I would decide later. My son asked about it, casually at first, then more directly. What are you planning to do with it? He asked one afternoon, sitting at the same kitchen table where I used to count cash. I'm not sure yet, I said. He nodded, then said, you should be careful. It's easy to make mistakes with things like that. Mistakes. That word sat wrong with me, like he was already correcting something I hadn't done. I reminded him that it was mine, that I'd earned it in my own way. He smiled, but there was tension in it. I just want to make sure it's handled properly, he said. Handled. I noticed how often he used words like that, neutral words, words that sound reasonable until you realize what they're taking away. He started talking about estate planning, about wills, about making sure things were clear. I told him I already had a will, that it had been in place for years. He asked to see it. That surprised me. I asked why. He said it was just to understand, to help if anything ever happened. I said no, not sharply, just firmly. His face changed then, just for a second. Something like irritation passed through it before he smoothed it away. That's fine, he said. I just thought it might be helpful. After that, things felt different. He still called, still visited, but there was a distance, a calculation. He asked more questions, about my health, about my memory, about whether I'd ever thought about giving him power of attorney just in case. I told him no, each time. I told him no. I didn't think I needed to explain myself. I was his mother. I was alive. I was present. I didn't realize then that he had already stopped hearing my answers. Looking back, there were signs, moments that didn't sit right but that I pushed aside because facing them felt worse. The time he asked me to sign a stack of papers he said were just for insurance, I told him I'd look at them later. He took them back without argument, but he looked annoyed. The way he started bringing up stories about older people getting taken advantage of, losing money, making bad decisions. He always framed it like concern, like he was protecting me. I wanted to believe that. I wanted to believe that my son loved me in the way I had loved him, that his worry came from care, not control. That's why the letter hit so hard, because it didn't come out of nowhere. It came at the end of a long line of moments where my voice had slowly stopped being enough. After I found the letter, I started thinking about all of it differently. Every conversation replayed itself in my mind, but with a new lens. I remembered how confident he had sounded when he talked about legal matters. How comfortable. I remembered how he had once joked that I was too trusting. I remembered how he had offered, more than once, to take care of things for me. I had said no. But maybe he had already decided that my no didn't count. That hurt more than the legal part, because it meant that somewhere along the way, my son had stopped seeing me as a person with agency, with rights, with boundaries. He had started seeing me as an obstacle, or a problem to solve. In the days after I received the letter, my routine continued. I woke up, I made coffee, I went to work, I answered emails, I smiled at people. On the outside, nothing changed. On the inside, everything was louder. I noticed how tired I was, not just physically, but emotionally. How much effort it took to stay calm, to not call him and scream, to not confront him before I understood what had happened. I needed to know how far this went. So I started paying attention. When he called, I listened more than I spoke. I asked questions without giving anything away. I watched how carefully he chose his words. He didn't mention the will. Not once. That told me something. If he thought he was doing the right thing truly, he would have told me. He would have explained. He would have tried to convince me. Instead, he said nothing. That silence was louder than any argument could have been. I thought about all the years I had spent teaching him honesty, teaching him to come to me when he made a mistake, teaching him that trust was something you built, not something you took. And here he was, quietly trying to rewrite my life while sitting across from me, asking how my day had been. I didn't sleep well during that time. I lay awake at night staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle. Every sound felt like a reminder that this place, this life could be taken from me without my consent if I didn't act. I thought about my age, about how easy it would be for someone to say I was confused, that I didn't remember things clearly, that I needed help. I was aware, in a way I had never been before, of how fragile control can be. It doesn't disappear all at once. It's chipped away, piece by piece, and if you're not careful, you wake up one day and realize someone else has been making decisions for you for a long time. I didn't want that to be my story. So I started gathering my own documents. Quietly, carefully, I made copies. I wrote dates down. I kept everything in one place, not because I was ready to fight, because I needed to understand. I needed to understand how my son had gotten to a point where he thought this was acceptable, how he had convinced himself that my life was something he could manage without my permission. That understanding didn't come easily. It came with grief, with the slow realization that the child I had raised and the adult sitting across from me were not the same person, and that loving him didn't mean trusting him anymore. That was the hardest part. The tension didn't arrive loudly. It slipped in quietly, like a draft you don't notice until you start feeling cold. I kept living my days the same way on the outside. Same routes, same routines, same polite conversations. But underneath it all, there was a steady pressure, like I was holding something heavy just out of sight. My son started calling more often again. At first, I wondered if he knew that I knew, if maybe the letter had tipped him off somehow. But his tone was casual, light, almost cheerful. He asked how I was feeling. That question used to feel warm. Now it felt measured. I'm fine, I said. Really? He replied, a little too quickly. You sound tired. I hadn't said I was tired. He talked about stress at work, about how busy his life had become, about how hard it was to balance everything. Then, without much pause, he shifted the conversation. Have you thought any more about making things official? He asked. Official? I said. Just paperwork, he replied. So things are easier down the line. Down the line. I felt my jaw tighten, but I kept my voice steady. What kind of paperwork? There was a brief silence. Not long enough to be obvious. Long enough to notice. You know, he said. Planning. Being responsible. I told him again that I already had plans. That I was comfortable with them. He sighed. Not dramatically. Just enough to signal disappointment. I just worry, he said. Sometimes people don't realize when they need help. There. It was again. That careful way of framing concern. So it sounded kind while still cutting something away. I asked him directly if he Thought I wasn't capable. He laughed, softly. Of course not. That's not what I'm saying. But he didn't say what he was saying. That became the pattern. He never accused me outright. Never said I was unwell or confused. He just suggested, implied, nudged. Each conversation left me feeling smaller somehow, like I was being slowly pressed into a shape that wasn't mine. When he visited, he watched me more closely. If I misplaced my keys, he noticed. If I repeated a story, he smiled and gently corrected me. You already told me that, he'd say. Sometimes I had. Sometimes I hadn't. Either way, the message was clear. I started doubting myself in small ways, pausing before I spoke, replaying conversations in my head afterward to make sure I hadn't missed something obvious. That frightened me more than anything else. Not because I was actually losing my grip, but because I could feel how easily someone could convince others that I was. He began offering to handle things for me. Bills, appointments, calls. I declined every time. Each refusal seemed to irritate him a little more, though he tried to hide it. His patience wore thinner. His smile didn't last as long. Once, when I told him I had already paid a bill he was reminding me about, he frowned. Well, I didn't see that come through, he said. I paid it by check, I replied. He shook his head slightly. That's not very efficient. Double quotes efficient. As if my life were a system that needed optimizing. The power imbalance grew quietly. He knew more about technology, about online systems, about legal language, and he leaned into that difference. Even if he didn't name it, he spoke with confidence, with authority, like someone used to being listened to. I noticed how often he interrupted me now, how quickly he corrected me, how easily he dismissed my preferences as habits instead of choices. One afternoon, he suggested I stop driving. That stopped me. I've never had an accident, I said. I know, he replied. But things change. I asked him what he meant. Reflexes, he said. Awareness. I felt heat rise in my chest. I'm fine. He held his hands up slightly, like he was calming a situation that didn't exist. I'm just thinking ahead, he said. Someone has to. Someone, not me. After that conversation, I sat alone for a long time. Longer than usual. I stared at the same spot on the wall and tried to make sense of how we had gotten here. I thought about all the years I had been strong so he didn't have to be. All the decisions I had made quietly, without help, without praise. And now, suddenly, I was being treated like a risk, like a liability. He never raised his voice, never threatened, never demanded outright control. That made it harder, because from the outside, it all looked reasonable. Concerned son, responsible adult, aging parent. If I told someone what was happening, would they see it the way I did? Or would they nod and say he was just trying to help? That question haunted me. It made me careful. It made me quiet, and I hated that. One evening, he came over with dinner. He set it on the table and talked the whole time about his plans, his career, his goals, where he saw himself in a few years. He spoke about stability, about building something lasting. Then he looked at me and said, I just don't want things to get messy later. Double quotes messy. As if my life were a problem waiting to happen. I asked him what he meant by later. He shrugged. You know, when decisions need to be made quickly. I asked him what decisions he thought those would be. He paused, then said, everything. I felt something harden inside me then. Not anger. Not yet. Resolve. I realized that while I had been trying to understand him, he had been quietly positioning himself, building a narrative. One where his involvement was necessary and my resistance was unreasonable. And I realized something else too. He wasn't going to stop on his own. The more I pushed back, the more subtle he became. The more he framed his actions as protection. That's how control works when it's wearing a gentle face. It doesn't force. It convinces. I started documenting everything. Dates, conversations, phrases he used, changes in tone. I wrote down what I said and what he replied, not because I wanted to trap him, because I needed to hold on to my own version of events. Gaslighting doesn't always come with lies. Sometimes it comes with doubt, with repetition, with enough questioning that you start to question yourself. I wasn't going to let that happen. I also started reaching out to people I trusted, carefully, casually. I mentioned things in passing, asked opinions without revealing too much. Some nodded, some brushed it off. A few looked concerned. That told me enough. I wasn't imagining this. The control wasn't dramatic. It was administrative, emotional, quiet, and it was tightening. The hardest part was pretending everything was normal while knowing it wasn't, sitting across from my son, smiling, listening, while a part of me stayed alert, watching for the next push. I missed the ease we used to have, the comfort, the trust, but I knew now that trust had already been broken. He just hadn't expected me to notice, and that realization, more than anything else, changed how I saw the road ahead. I made the appointment quietly. I didn't tell my son. I didn't hint. I didn't ask for his opinion. I took a morning off work and drove myself across town to a law office that had nothing to do with the name on the letter. I chose it on purpose. I wanted clean ground. No shared history. No assumptions. The building was plain. Glass doors. Neutral carpet. The kind of place where nothing about the space tries to tell you who you are. That mattered more than I expected. When I sat down across from the attorney, my hands were steady. My voice didn't shake. I had rehearsed what I would say, but once I started, the words came on their own. I told her everything, not emotionally, not dramatically, just clearly. The letter, the forged signature, the power of attorney I never signed, the way my son had been speaking to me, the pressure that had built over time. She listened without interrupting, took notes, asked questions that were precise and careful. When I finished, she leaned back slightly in her chair and looked at me. What you're describing, she said, is very serious. I nodded. I already knew that. She explained the documents, how they should have been verified, how signatures are supposed to be witnessed, how a power of attorney can't just appear without proper confirmation. She also explained something else. Intent matters, not just legally, emotionally. If someone truly believes they're helping, she said, they usually involve the person they're helping. They don't hide it. That landed deep. She told me I had options, more than I realized. I could challenge the documents, file a report, force a review. I could also protect myself going forward, lock things down, make my wishes unmistakably clear. Then she asked me a question I wasn't expecting. What do you want to happen with your estate now? Not what did I want to undo. What did I want to do? I sat with that for a moment. I thought about my son, about the boy he had been, about the man he had become, about the line between love and trust, and how one can survive without the other. I want control, I said finally. While I still have it, she nodded. We went through everything slowly, methodically. My original will, the new documents, the inconsistencies, the signature that wasn't mine. She confirmed what I already knew. The power of attorney was invalid. The changes were not legally binding. They had been filed, yes, but that didn't make them real. Relief washed over me then, but it was tempered, quiet, careful, because relief didn't erase what had been attempted. She suggested we formally revoke any existing or submitted powers of attorney immediately, in writing. We did that. Then she asked again about my will. This time, I didn't hesitate. I want to rewrite it, I said, not out of spite, out of clarity. We talked for hours, about specifics, about language, about safeguards. She suggested adding clauses that required independent verification of my capacity if anything were ever questioned. She suggested naming a neutral third party for oversight, protection, not punishment. And then we came to the part I knew was coming. Beneficiaries. I took a breath. I didn't remove my son completely. That wasn't the point, but I changed things. I structured it so that nothing would be accessible through pressure or assumption, so that nothing could be taken early, so that everything required transparency. And I documented my reasons, not emotionally, not accusingly, just truthfully, because the truth matters. When I left the office that day, the sky was overcast. The air felt heavy but steady. I sat in my car for a moment before driving away. I expected to feel guilty. I didn't. I felt calm. That calm didn't last long. 2 days later, my son called. His voice was tight, controlled. Did you go to a lawyer? He asked. I didn't pretend. Yes. There was silence on the line. Then, why? I could hear the effort it took him to keep his voice even. Because documents were filed in my name without my consent, I said. Another pause. I was trying to help, he said. You're making this into something it doesn't need to be. I told him I knew about the power of attorney. He exhaled sharply. You're overreacting. I felt the old instinct rise, the urge to smooth things over, to protect him from consequences. I let it pass. You signed my name, I said. That's not help. His tone changed then, sharper, defensive. You would have agreed eventually, he said. I was just getting ahead of it. As if my consent were a formality. I told him the documents had been revoked, that the will had been rewritten. He went quiet. Then he said, "So you don't trust me?" It wasn't a question. I thought about lying, about softening it. "I trust myself," I said. "And that has to be enough." He accused me of being unfair, of punishing him, of listening to people who didn't understand our family. I didn't argue. I told him what mattered. "You took a choice from me," I said. "I'm taking it back." He hung up. The aftermath wasn't explosive. It was cold. He didn't call for a while, didn't visit. When he did reach out, it was brief, formal, careful. The power had shifted, not because I raised my voice, because I drew a line. There were moments when doubt crept in. Late at night, early mornings. I wondered if I had gone too far, if I had damaged something beyond repair. Then I remembered. The signature that wasn't mine, the silence, the assumption, and the doubt faded. I didn't want revenge. I wanted dignity, and I had reclaimed it. The quiet that followed surprised me, not because my son stopped calling every day. I had expected that. What surprised me was how calm the silence felt once it settled in. First, I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop. A confrontation, an angry visit, some dramatic attempt to explain himself or change my mind. None of that came. Days passed, then weeks. Life didn't return to what it had been before, but it did something better. It steadied. I woke up in the mornings without that tight feeling in my chest. I drank my coffee without replaying conversations in my head. I stopped checking my phone every few minutes, bracing myself for another carefully worded message that left me feeling smaller. I hadn't realized how much of my energy had been going into staying alert. When that stopped, I felt lighter. Not happy exactly, but settled. I kept working. I kept my routines. I watered my plants. I fixed small things around the house. I lived inside my days instead of around them. The lawyer sent confirmation letters. Everything was documented. Everything was locked in place. No loose ends. That mattered more than I expected, because once the legal part was done, what remained was emotional. And emotional things don't resolve on paper. My son eventually reached out again, not to argue, not to apologize, just a short message asking how I was doing. I read it twice before responding. "I'm doing okay," I wrote back. "I hope you are too." That was it. No explanations, no defenses, no invitations. He replied with a simple, "Good," and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel the urge to fill the space with reassurance. I let the conversation end there. That was new for me. I had spent most of my life smoothing things over, making sure everyone felt comfortable, making sure tension didn't linger. But I was learning something important. Not all discomfort needs to be fixed. Some of it needs to be respected. Months passed. We saw each other occasionally, birthdays, holidays, always polite, always careful. The dynamic had changed, and we both knew it. He no longer spoke to me like I was fragile. He didn't suggest changes. He didn't offer to handle things. He listened more, not warmly, not easily, but he listened. I could feel the restraint in him, the awareness that there were boundaries now, and that crossing them would have consequences. That wasn't a victory. It was balance, and balance is quieter than people expect. There were moments of sadness. Of course there were. Grief doesn't always come from loss. Sometimes it comes from adjustment. I grieved the version of our relationship where trust had been simple, where love didn't need guardrails. I grieved the idea that my son would always see me as capable simply because I was his mother. But grief didn't consume me. It passed through me, because alongside it was something else. Pride. Not loud pride. Not the kind you announce. The quiet pride of knowing I stood up for myself when it would have been easier not to. I had protected my autonomy without cruelty. I had drawn lines without erasing love. That mattered to me. One afternoon, I sat at the same kitchen table where I had once counted cash and later lined up legal papers. The light came in just right, warming the wood. I thought about inheritance, not money, legacy. What do we leave behind when we're gone? I realized it wasn't just assets or property. It was example. My son had learned many things from me over the years. Hard work, endurance, sacrifice. Now, whether he liked it or not, he had learned something else, that I was not invisible, that my voice mattered, that love does not cancel consent. I didn't say that out loud to him. I didn't need to. Some lessons don't need speeches, they need consistency. There were no dramatic apologies, no tearful reconciliations, and that was okay, because justice, when it's real, is often quiet. It doesn't shout. It settles. I kept my will updated. I reviewed things regularly. I made sure my wishes were clear and protected, not because I lived in fear, but because I lived in ownership. I stopped feeling guilty for saying no. I stopped explaining myself when I didn't want to. I trusted my instincts again. That might have been the greatest gift of all. I had raised a son. I had built a life. I had survived loss and strain and years of putting myself second, and when the moment came that tested whether I still believed my life was mine, I answered clearly, yes. I didn't rewrite my will to punish. I rewrote it to tell the truth, and the truth was simple. I was still here, I was still capable, and my story was still mine to decide.